The wind came down from the Beartooth Range like something that had been waiting all year for permission to be cruel. It moved through Clearwater Valley without apology, bending the ponderosa pines along the ridge until they groaned like old men rising from their knees. And then it found the road, the frozen mud road that ran between the hills toward Sutter's Post, and it found Garrett Pruitt on that road, hunched over the neck of a horse that had given up caring about the cold sometime around noon. Garrett had not given up, but he was getting close. He was 36 years old and he looked 50. Not because life had been unkind exactly, but because he had asked more of it than most men do, and it had answered him in ways he had not expected. There were lines in his face that had no business being there, carved by seasons and silence and 3 winters of sleeping alone in a house that still smelled like someone else used to live in it. His coat was patched at both elbows. His boots were good because a man who works land learns early that boots are not vanity, they are survival. Everything else about him said he had stopped paying attention to the difference between surviving and living sometime around the winter of 1884. On the left breast of his coat, half hidden under the collar, was a small brass pin, the kind the Union Veterans League gave out at their annual meetings in Helena. He wore it not out of pride, but out of habit, the same way a man keeps a scar he stopped noticing years ago. He had been a soldier once, before the ranch, before Clara, before all of it. He was not thinking about any of that now. He was thinking about the horse he needed to buy. The mare under him was 12 years old and retirement age by any honest measure, and what Garrett needed was something younger, something with shoulders that could pull the weight of a failing operation through one more spring planting. The Pruitt Ranch was not dead yet, but it was the kind of not dead that looks a lot like dying if you squint at it wrong. The south fence had been rebuilt twice with salvaged wire. The root cellar was 2/3 empty when it should have been full. The last cow had gone down in November with a lung ailment that the veterinarian from Billings described with a long Latin name that translated as far as Garrett could tell into the single word gone. He needed a horse. He had one thing left to offer for one. His hand moved to the rifle scabbard without thinking, the way a man reaches for something he has carried so long it has become part of the architecture of his body. The Winchester was his father's before it was his. Walnut stock worn smooth at the grip, the brass plate on the heel stamped with initials that were not Garrett's own. R.H.P. Raymond Harold Pruitt. His father had carried it through the war and home again, and when he died he left it to Garrett along with 40 acres of cold Montana ground and a handshake philosophy about debt owe nothing. Hold nothing, let nothing own you. Garrett had held the rifle for 19 years. He was about to find out what it was worth. Sutter's Post appeared out of the gray afternoon like something the landscape had misplaced and never bothered to retrieve. It sat at the convergence of 2 wagon roads that crossed each other at an angle no surveyor had intended, and around it had accumulated over the years the particular debris of a place where desperate people stopped on their way. Between bad situations, a half-collapsed hayshed, a hitching rail, worn silver by weather, a sign above the door that read, "Trade and Supply," in letters that had faded to near invisibility. Smoke came from the chimney. That was something. Garrett tied the mare to the rail and stood for a moment with his hand on her neck, feeling the warmth of her through the leather of his glove, and he thought not for the first time that he was sorry for what he was asking of her. She had carried him every mile he had ever ridden that mattered. She deserved better than a cold rail outside a dying trading post in the worst January in a decade. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke and the smell of hides stacked in the corner. Old Sutter sat behind the counter doing what Old Sutter always did, which was nothing in particular, with the focused intensity of a man who had elevated idleness to a discipline. He was past 60 caring what anyone thought of him, and he looked at Garrett the way men look at things they have already seen too many times to find interesting. "Pruitt," he said. Not a greeting, just identification. "I need a horse," Garrett said. "Something that can pull. I have trade." "What trade?" Garrett said nothing. He walked to the counter and unclipped the Winchester from his shoulder and laid it across the worn wood between them. Sutter looked at it for a long time without touching it. "That's Raymond Pruitt's rifle," he said. It is. You're trading it. If the horse is worth it. Sutter picked it up, turned it over, checked the mechanism with the automatic competence of a man who had handled 1,000 firearms. He set it back down. Come look at what I have. What he had was not much. 2 geldings that had been worked past their usefulness and a sorrel mare with a sway in her back that told a story of hard years and harder owners. Garrett walked the pen twice, looking at each animal the way a man looks when he already knows he is going to be disappointed but owes it to himself to make sure. The geldings were too old for heavy work. The sorrel might pull one season if treated well and asked nothing extraordinary. He was turning to say so when he heard the sound. He stopped. It was not an animal sound. He knew animal sounds the way he knew weather instinctively in the body before the mind caught up. This was something else. A shift of weight on frozen ground. A breath held and then released very carefully like someone practicing invisibility. It came from the far end of the pen, past where the sorrel stood. Garrett walked toward it. The stall at the back of the pen was separated from the others by a low plank wall, and it was meant for overflow stock, a temporary holding space for animals that needed to be kept apart. It was not meant for what was in it now. She was sitting on the ground with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up to her chest, and she was looking at him with eyes that had made a calculation about him before he had taken his second step in her direction. Not fear exactly. Something past fear, something that fear leaves behind. When it has been present so long, it becomes the weather instead of the event. She was young, mid-20s if he had to guess, with dark hair pulled back roughly, and a coat that was not a coat so much as several layers of inadequate cloth held together by determination. Her hands were bare. Her wrists were bound with a length of leather cord looped twice around a rusted iron ring bolted into the post above her. But that was not what stopped him. What stopped him was what she was doing with her hands. She was working at the knot. Not panicking, not crying. She was methodically, patiently working a small piece of bent metal, something that might have been a sewing needle or a thin piece of harness wire, into the loops of the cord, testing each movement with the concentration of a woman who had thought this problem through and was working her way through the solution one step at a time. She looked up at him without stopping. "If you've come to buy me," she said, "I want you to know something first." Her voice was quieter than the wind outside, but it carried. "I'll run the first chance I get. Not out of spite, just so you know before you spend anything." Garrett stood where he was. Something was happening in his chest that he did not have immediate language for. Not pity. He had known pity, and this was not it. This was something older and harder than pity, something that lived in the part of a man that was formed before he learned to be careful. He turned around. "Sutter," he said. The old man had followed him and stood a few feet back with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone watching a situation develop that they would prefer not to be responsible for. "Who does she belong to?" Garrett asked. The word tasted like something spoiled in his mouth. "Royce Danner left her here. Said he'd be back inside 5 days. That was 10 days ago." "On what basis?" "She's got a work contract, signed when she was 16. Danner's been her legal guardian since she was 9. Contract gives him right to her labor and residence until she's 26. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Let me see the contract." Sutter disappeared and came back with a folded document that had been handled many times. Garrett opened it on top of the plank wall in the fading light that came through the gaps in the shed roof, and he read it with the careful attention of a man who had once had cause to read documents like this very carefully indeed. He found what he was looking for in the third paragraph. Not the terms. The seal. Pressed into the lower left corner of the contract, slightly smeared but legible, was the mark of the Montana Landowners Consortium. A private body, not a court, not a government office. A private body that had operated out of Helena for 15 years, doing things that wore the costume of legality without possessing its substance. Garrett knew that seal. He had last seen it on a document that had cost him 11 acres of bottomland and 4 months of a lawyer's time to contest back in the winter of 1882. He had won barely, and the winning had cost him more than the land was worth. He knew the men behind that seal. He knew their methods. He knew what their contracts were designed to do and what they were designed to prevent. He folded the document and set it on the plank wall. "This contract isn't valid," he said. The words came out flat and certain, the way a statement comes out when a man is not arguing but reporting a fact. Under federal statute, any labor contract signed by a person under 18 years of age requires countersignature from a legal guardian appointed by a territorial court. Not a self-appointed guardian, a court-appointed one. Danner never went before a judge to establish guardianship. I would bet everything I own on that. Sutter was quiet. "I know, because," Garrett continued, and now something shifted in his voice. Not anger, something quieter and colder than anger. "The same organization that issued this seal tried the same arrangement on me 4 years ago. Different terms. Same seal, same method. I spent 4 months in a Helena courtroom over it." He picked up the document and held it out to Sutter. "This paper isn't worth what it was printed on." From behind him, from the back stall, came the sound of a breath being drawn in sharply, then held. Sutter rubbed his jaw. He looked at the rifle on the counter inside. He looked at Garrett. He performed the calculation that men like Sutter perform, which is not a moral calculation but an economic one, and he arrived at the answer that caused him the least future difficulty. "The sorrel and the girl," Garrett said. "For the Winchester." Sutter looked at the rifle again for a long moment. "Danner's going to come looking," he said. "That's between Danner and me." Another pause. Sutter picked up the Winchester. "Done," he said. He did not look happy about it. He did not look unhappy either. He looked like a man who had just passed a problem to someone better equipped to carry it. Garrett walked back to the stall. The woman had stopped working at the knot. She was watching him with the same measuring attention she had given him from the first moment. He crouched down and took the leather cord between his hands and worked the knot apart. Not rushing, not making it dramatic, just undoing it the way you undo any knot that was tied without much skill and held without much purpose. When it fell away, she did not move. She looked at her wrists, then at him. "You said it wasn't a valid contract," she said. "It isn't. Is that true, or did you say it to get a better price?" He met her eyes, gray the color of river water in November and steady in a way that most people's eyes are not. "Both," he said. But the true part was true first. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile. It was smaller than a smile and more complicated. It was the expression of a person who has just received information they needed but are not yet sure what to do with. She stood. She was shorter than he expected, which meant nothing, and she moved with a carefulness that spoke of a body accustomed to being aware of the space it occupied in relation to other people. "My name is Ivy Calhoun," she said. "Garrett Pruitt." She looked at him for another moment with those measuring eyes. Then she walked past him toward the gate, and he followed, and neither of them looked back at the stall they were leaving behind. On the wagon outside, as Sutter's post disappeared behind the first bend in the road, Ivy sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes forward. The cold had settled in fully now, the kind of cold that makes the air feel solid, and she drew her layers tighter around herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been cold before and knew it was a problem to be managed rather than felt. 10 minutes passed in silence. 20. Then she spoke, still looking at the road ahead. "You said both," she said. "When I asked if it was true, or if you said it to get a price, you said both." "That's right." "Which one were you more interested in?" Garrett thought about it honestly, which was a thing he tried to do. "The true part," he said. "The price was just the vehicle." She turned and looked at him, then a longer look than any she had given him before. He kept his eyes on the road. "All right," she said. Not "thank you," not "I believe you," just "all right." The 2 words of a person who has made a provisional decision to wait and see. She turned back to the road. He drove. The mountains watched them go. The Pruitt Ranch appeared first as a smear of lamplight between the dark shapes of the pines, then as a shape, then as a place. Small, low-built from the land itself, in the way that old Montana homesteads were built, not against the landscape but into it, using the natural windbreak of the ridge to the north and the slope of the ground to drain water away from the foundations. The house had been standing for 22 years. It looked like it. But there was something in its endurance, in the particular stubbornness of structures that have outlasted what was expected of them, that was not without its own quiet dignity. The chimney was straight. The roof, though, patched twice over shed water. The porch boards had been replaced within the last 2 years, you could tell by the color of the wood, darker where they met the older frame. Garrett pulled the wagon to a stop by the barn, unhitched the mare, and led her inside without ceremony. Ivy climbed down from the wagon unassisted. She stood in the yard and looked at the house with the particular attention of someone committing a landscape to memory mapping exits and angles and distances the way animals do when placed somewhere new. Then the front door opened. Agnes Pruitt was 62 years old, and she was a woman who had spent those 62 years being right about things and had consequently developed a face that expressed at rest a dignified expectation of disappointment. She was not a large woman, but she occupied her space with the authority of someone who had earned the right to occupy it, and when she stood in that doorway with the lamplight behind her and the cold air pressing in around her, she looked like a judgment that had decided to take human form. She looked at Ivy. The look lasted 4 seconds. In that time it traveled from the tangled hair down to the inadequate layers of cloth that passed for a coat across the bare hands and up to the face. Then she looked at Garrett. "Where's the horse?" she said. "Barn. Just the one. Just the one." Agnes looked back at Ivy. "Come inside," she said, in the voice she used for things she had decided to deal with without making a production of deciding. The kitchen was warm. Not comfortable warm, not the warmth of a house maintained with attention to comfort, but the working warmth of a stove that was kept burning because it was practical and served multiple purposes. A pot sat on the back burner. The table was wooden and clean and had the particular scars of a surface that had been used for everything, not just eating. Garrett took off his coat and hung it on one of the 2 hooks by the door. The second hook was empty. Ivy noticed the hooks. She noticed the way Garrett's hand lingered half a second on the empty one before he turned away. She noticed the child-sized coat folded on the chair at the head of the table. She noticed that Agnes, when she moved through the kitchen, navigated around that chair without looking at it the way people move around furniture that has become invisible through years of accommodation. She did not say anything about what she noticed. She sat where she was gestured to sit and accepted the bowl of food that was placed in front of her and ate it slowly with the focused discipline of someone who has learned to eat when eating is available because available is not guaranteed. The meal passed in silence. Garrett ate and looked at the fire. Agnes ate and did not look at the chair she was not looking at. Ivy ate and looked at both of them and began to understand in the way she had always understood things through observation rather than explanation what kind of house she had come into. When the bowls were cleared, Agnes went to the far end of the kitchen and stood with her back to the room. Garrett looked at Ivy. "You can have the room at the end of the hall," he said. "Lock works from the inside." She looked at him. "I'll bring extra blankets," he said. "It gets cold on that side of the house." She waited. He waited. Then she said, "Why are you telling me about the lock?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I want you to know it exists." Another pause. Another measurement. "All right," she said. The same 2 words as before, but different this time, carrying slightly more weight. She went to the room. It was small and cold and smelled of cedar, and the window looked out over the back slope of the property toward the dark shapes of the mountains. The bed was plain, a wood frame with a rope lattice and a mattress stuffed with something that had seen better days. But it was a bed, a real bed with space around it, and a door she could close, and she stood in the middle of it for a long time without moving, feeling the walls on all sides of her close but not pressing, present but not threatening. She took the letter out of her pocket. She did not open it. She had read it so many times she knew it the way she knew her own breathing. She just held it, the envelope worn soft at the folds, The paper inside shifted and resettled after years of being read and refolded and read again. Her mother's handwriting on the front. Her name, Ivy. She set it on the nightstand and lay down on top of the covers with her coat still on, and she listened to the sounds of the house, the crack of the fire, the low sound of the wind finding the gaps around the window frames, the careful steps of Agnes moving through the kitchen. No raised voices, no footsteps that came toward her door and then stopped. She listened for a long time and nothing came, and eventually the nothing came so consistently that something in her chest began very slowly to unclench. She was still awake at midnight. She knew because she heard Garrett go outside. She heard the front door, heard his boots on the porch, and she lay in the dark and counted to 30, and then got up and went to the window. He was sitting on the porch step, which she could see from the angle of her window if she stood at the far left corner of the glass. He had a mug in his hands. He was not drinking from it. He was just holding it, looking out at the dark shape of the barn, and beyond it, at the black mass of the mountains against the slightly less black sky. On his knee was a small book, a notebook from the shape of it, dark cover worn at the corners. He did not open it. He just held it with his left hand resting on the cover. Ivy had a facility for reading people that she had developed early and honed out of necessity the way you sharpen any tool you depend on for survival. And what she read in Garrett Pruitt's posture in that moment was not sadness exactly, because sadness is an active state. Sadness is something that rises and falls. Sadness moves through a person. What she saw in him was more like sediment, the settled accumulation of grief that has stopped being grief and become the bedrock of a person's life, the layer everything else is built on without acknowledgement. He was carrying something. She did not know what yet. She stepped back from the window and returned to the bed, and this time she did not think about the letter, or the land, or Royce Danner, or the 10 days she had spent in a stock pen waiting to find out what kind of man would eventually come through the gate. She thought about a man sitting on a porch in the cold holding a book he would not open. She thought there was a story in that. She slept. In the morning, Agnes was in the kitchen before light. This was not a statement about Agnes's virtue or work ethic. It was simply the pattern of a woman whose relationship with sleep had been disrupted years ago and never fully restored. She had the stove going and water heated before anyone else was awake, and she was at the table with her hands around a mug when she heard the door at the end of the hall. She did not turn around. Ivy came into the kitchen the way she had come into everything so far, quietly, observantly, taking up as little declarative space as possible. She looked at the stove, at the mug in Agnes's hands, at the second mug on the counter that was not Agnes's. Agnes still did not turn around. "Coffee's in the pot," she said. "Mugs are on the left." A pause. Then the sound of the cupboard, the pour of liquid, the small adjustments of a person finding a place to stand. "Sit down if you're going to be in here," Agnes said. Another pause, then the scrape of a chair. They sat without speaking for several minutes. Agnes looked at the window. Ivy looked at her mug. Outside, the first gray edge of dawn was beginning to define the line between the mountains and the sky. Agnes spoke without looking at her. "How long did he leave you at Sutter's?" 10 days. Agnes made a sound that was not quite a word. "Did you eat?" "Sutter fed me twice a day." "Oats." Another of those sounds from Agnes. A person fluent in her register would have recognized it as the sound she made when something confirmed a low opinion she already held. "You can help me in the kitchen," Agnes said, "if you want something to do." "All right. I'm not offering conversation. I'm not asking for it." Agnes looked at her then for the first time that morning, a quick look evaluating the way she looked at everything. What she saw caused something small to shift in her face, almost invisible, a fraction of a degree in the set of her jaw. She turned back to the window. "Breakfast is at 6, she said. "Don't be late." "I won't be." They finished their coffee in silence. Later that morning, Garrett came in from the barn to find Ivy on her knees by the far wall of the kitchen, scrubbing the baseboard with a rag and a bucket of soapy water. She was doing it with the same methodical attention she had brought to the knot in the stock pen, working in sections, not rushing, doing the job completely before moving to the next part. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She did not look up. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She kept scrubbing. He stood there another second, then went to the stove to pour himself coffee. When he turned back around, she was still working her back to him, and he watched her for a moment with an expression that no one was there to see, an expression that had something careful in it, careful in the way of a man who has learned to be suspicious of things that feel like relief. He went back outside. That afternoon he came in to find that the baseboard was clean and Ivy was gone. His coat was on its hook. Agnes was at the stove. The folded coat on the head of the table chair was still there. Nothing had moved. He went looking for Ivy and found her in the barn, standing at the sorrel's stall, talking to the horse in a low voice that he could not make out the words of from the barn door. The horse's head was over the stall board, and Ivy had her hand on its muzzle, and they were engaged in the quiet communion of a person and an animal who have both decided provisionally that trust is worth experimenting with. Garrett went back to the house without announcing himself. That night he sat on the porch again. This time he did not sit long before he heard the door, and this time he did not wait to see what would happen. He just made room on the step. She came out without a coat, which was its own kind of statement about priorities, and she sat down 2 feet away from him, not close enough to suggest anything, not far enough to be a declaration of distance. They sat in the cold and looked at the dark. After a while he said, "I didn't know what I was doing when I brought you here." "I know," she said. "That's not an apology." "I didn't take it as one." Another silence. "I have nowhere else to go," she said, not with self-pity, with the same flat accuracy she brought to most things. "Right now, this is the only situation I'm in that isn't worse than the one before. So I'm here." "Fair enough." She looked at the mountains. He looked at the barn. The cold pressed in around them the way cold does, familiar and indifferent. "You're going to want to know things," he said, "about why Danner left me there, about what the contract was really about my mother. When you want to tell me," he said, "it might be important." "Most things are," he said. "That doesn't mean they have to be said tonight." Something passed through her, something small and difficult to name, like the feeling of setting down a weight that you have been carrying for so long you had forgotten you were carrying it. She looked at the empty hook by the door that she could see through the kitchen window from where she sat. "Who lived here before?" she asked. The question was oblique on purpose, a door held open rather than knocked on. He was quiet for a long time. "My wife," he said. "Clara. She died 3 winters ago." "I'm sorry." "So am I." On his knee was the notebook again. She had not seen him pick it up. It was just there the way things that have become part of a person are just there without transition. She did not ask about it. He did not explain it. Agnes came to the door behind them, and without a word, without acknowledging either of them, she set a third mug of coffee on the porch rail within reach and went back inside. Ivy looked at the mug. She looked at the closed door. She understood that this was a thing that could not be explained, that required no explanation, that existed in the register of gesture rather than language in the way that the most important communications between people often do. She reached out and picked up the mug. The coffee was hot. In the room she had been given before she slept, Ivy took the letter out of her coat pocket, and this time she opened it. She read it through twice slowly. Her mother's handwriting crowded at the margins where there had not been enough paper for everything that needed to be said. There was a name in the 3rd paragraph that she had read 100 times, a name that made everything Royce Danner had done into a shape that had a beginning and a direction and a reason. A name that told her, if she could prove it, if she could stand in front of the right person and prove what her mother had written, that everything she had lost since she was 18 years old belonged to her. She folded the letter with care. She put it back in the envelope. She lay in the dark and thought about the man on the porch with the notebook he would not open, who had laid down his father's rifle for a woman he did not know, and said both when she asked him why. She thought about the seal on the contract. She thought about what he had said. The same organization, the same method. 4 years ago, he told Sutter. And then he had said something else, quieter, almost to himself. "I spent 4 months in a Helena courtroom over it." She had not asked him what he had found in that courtroom. She had not asked him why he had kept the documents she suspected he kept. She had not asked him what he knew about a man named Royce Danner and a piece of land in the Clearwater Valley that had changed hands in the winter of 1881, 3 months after her father died. Those were questions for another time. But lying in the dark in a house where someone had left a mug of coffee on the porch without being asked, in a room with a lock that worked from the inside. For the first time in a very long time, Ivy Calhoun did not feel like a woman who had run out of options. She felt like a woman who was finally in the right place to begin. Outside, the wind had dropped. The mountains were still there in the dark, carrying all that weight of stone and cold and time-patient in the way that only things without urgency can be patient, waiting for the season to turn, the way they had waited through every season before this one, without anxiety, without hope, simply present and enduring, and there. The fire in the stove settled with a low sound like a sigh. The days after the first snow of deep winter have a particular quality in Montana that is unlike any other kind of time. They are slow and they are honest. There is nowhere to go that is not difficult to reach. Nothing to distract from the basic facts of survival, no performance possible when the cold has stripped everything back to function. You learn who a person is in those days, not from what they say, but from what they do, when they think no one is paying attention, from the small decisions they make at 4 in the morning, when the fire has gone low and the wind is pressing at every seam of the house, and there is no audience for virtue or pretense. Garrett Pruitt. Ivy learned in those days was a man who made the same decisions whether he was being watched or not. She learned this because she watched him. It was not surveillance born of suspicion, not after the first week. It became something else. Something closer to the way you watch a landscape. You are learning to live in with attention and without judgment, mapping the patterns to understand the territory. He rose before light every morning and spent the first hour alone in the barn, not because the horses required an hour of attention, but because he required an hour of solitude, a transition from sleep to wakefulness that he needed to make without witnesses. He ate at the same time every day with the regularity of a man who had learned that routine was a form of ballast. He repaired things when they needed repairing and did not wait to be asked. And he did this with the focused economy of someone for whom physical work had long since become a form of thinking. He did not talk about Clara. He did not avoid the subject with the elaborate deflections of someone guarding a wound. He simply did not introduce her the way you do not introduce the air you breathe, because it is everywhere, and mentioning it would be redundant. But she was present in the house in 100 specific ways, in the blue coat on the chair, in the way Agnes set the kitchen, in the particular configuration of tools hanging in the barn, arranged by a hand that was not Garrett's and not Agnes's. Ivy did not ask. She had her own things she was not asking about. What she did was work. She worked with the same methodical efficiency she had applied to everything since she was old enough to understand that competence was the only form of protection available to someone in her position. She mucked stalls without being told when to muck them. She learned from watching Garrett how to check the tension on the fence wire along the north pasture, and she did it without commentary, and when she found a section that was loose, she tightened it before he had a chance to notice it needed doing. She helped Agnes in the kitchen, not as a student accepts instruction, but as a person with their own capability finds a rhythm with another person's capability, each adjusting to the other without discussion. Agnes noticed. Agnes noticed everything, which was in some ways a burden, and in other ways a form of vigilance that had kept her functional through things that might have flattened a less observant person. What she noticed about Ivy was that the girl never did anything for effect. Every action was purposeful. There was no performance of helpfulness, no bid for approval in the way she worked, which meant that when she worked, it was because she had decided the work needed doing. Agnes had known too many people who worked to be seen working. This was not that. It did not make her warm to Ivy overnight. Agnes was not a person who warmed overnight. She was a person who made assessments and then revised them only when the evidence required it, and the evidence was building slowly into a shape that she was not yet prepared to name. But on the fourth morning, when Ivy came into the kitchen before dawn and found Agnes at the table in the way Agnes was always at the table before dawn, she poured her own coffee, and then, without being asked, refilled Agnes's cup, and Agnes sat with that refilled cup for a moment before she said, without looking up, "Clara used to do that." A statement, not a complaint. Ivy sat down and said nothing. Agnes looked out the window. The sky outside was the particular charcoal color of a Montana morning before the sun makes its decision about whether to appear. "She was 28 when she died," Agnes said. "She had been sick the better part of 2 years, but she didn't tell anyone how sick, not even me, until the last winter. She was stubborn that way." A pause. "She got it from me." Ivy held her coffee mug. She did not move because she understood that some things require stillness, the way fires require air, that if you add too much of yourself to certain moments, you snuff them out. "Garrett wasn't here," Agnes said, "when she died. He was in Billings working. He'd been going to Billings regular for work that winter, and she didn't want him to know how bad it had gotten because she knew he'd come home and there wasn't anything to come home to do." A longer pause. She was trying to protect him. That was the kind of woman she was. Agnes stopped. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've been angry at him for 3 years," she said, "for not being here. I know it's not fair. I know she didn't tell him. I know all of that." She looked at the window. Knowing a thing and feeling a thing are not the same. Ivy said, "No, they're not." Agnes looked at her then. "No," she said, "they're not." That was the conversation that changed the temperature of the house. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way temperature actually changes gradually and then permanently, the new level becoming the baseline without announcement. Agnes began to teach Ivy to cook, not as a favor but as a practical matter, which was the only frame in which Agnes performed any action. She taught her the way she had taught Clara, by doing and expecting attention by not repeating instructions, and not offering praise by the withholding of correction when something was done right. Ivy received this form of instruction the way she received most things, as information to be processed and applied, and she learned fast, which Agnes acknowledged by silently increasing the difficulty of what she assigned. One afternoon, Agnes put a worn recipe card on the counter in front of Ivy without comment and walked out of the kitchen. The card was in handwriting that was not Agnes's. Ivy looked at it for a moment, then began to gather the ingredients, and when the bread came out of the oven, an hour later, Agnes came in and cut a slice and ate it standing at the counter and said nothing at all, but she put the recipe card in the drawer where she kept the ones she used regularly. Ivy saw her do it. She did not say anything about it either. There were small currencies exchanged in that house that had no names, that circulated without ledger, and they were building into something that none of the 3 people living there had a word for yet, which was fine because it did not need a word yet. It needed time, and time was the one thing the winter had in abundance. Deputy Clem Hatcher came on a Thursday 2 weeks after Ivy's arrival. He rode up to the gate in his official capacity, which announced itself through the set of his shoulders and the particular combination of duty and discomfort that younger lawmen wear when they have been asked to do something they have not yet decided if they agree with. He was 28, clean-shaven, in a county where most men weren't, and he had the face of someone who had grown up hearing that the law was a straight line and was in the process of discovering it was anything but. Garrett was at the fence when Hatcher arrived, and he walked to the gate and waited. "Mr. Pruitt," Hatcher said, "I have to ask about the Calhoun woman. Royce Danner filed a complaint with the sheriff's office. Says she was removed from a legal arrangement without proper procedure." "She's here," Garrett said. "She's here of her own choosing. You can ask her." Hatcher looked uncertain about something. "If you could just confirm that she's—" "Ask her," Garrett said again. Hatcher tied his horse and followed Garrett to the house where Ivy was splitting kindling by the woodpile with the competent authority of someone who had been doing it for years. She looked up when they approached, set the hatchet down, and waited. Hatcher took off his hat. "Miss Calhoun, I need to ask you directly whether you're here voluntarily and whether you're being treated—" "I'm here because I chose to be here," Ivy said. Her voice was level and without inflection, the voice of a person making a statement for the record. "I'm not being held. I'm not under any obligation. If you have questions about me, ask me directly. Don't ask the man standing next to me." She looked at Hatcher with the same gray steadiness she brought to everything. "That goes for any time you come here." Hatcher put his hat back on. He had the decency to look slightly ashamed. "Yes, ma'am." He turned to go. Then he stopped. He stood with his back to them for a moment, looking at his horse, and when he spoke it was quiet enough that the wind almost took it. "For what it's worth, Mr. Pruitt." He still wasn't looking at them. "I don't think that contract holds up. I looked at it myself. The seal on it is a private consortium, not a court seal." A pause. "I'm just a deputy. I follow the direction of the sheriff, and the sheriff has known Royce Danner for 20 years. He got on his horse. "I'm just saying what I think," he said. "For what it's worth." He rode away. Garrett watched him go. Ivy watched Garrett watch him go. "He came here to tell you something," she said. "He came here to do his job," Garrett said. "And tell me something. Both." She thought about that. About the difference between what a person is required to do and what they choose to do inside those requirements, the small acts of conscience that exist in the margins of obligation. That night, after Agnes had gone to bed, Ivy sat at the kitchen table and looked at Garrett across the remains of dinner. "I need to show you something," she said. He waited. She went to her room and came back with the letter. She set it on the table between them and stepped back, and he looked at it without touching it for a moment, reading her intent in the deliberateness of the gesture. Then he picked it up, unfolded it with the careful respect of a man handling something that matters to someone else, and he read. He read it through once without expression. Then he read certain sections again slower, and when he set it down, his eyes were not on the letter, but on something in the middle distance, the expression of a man making connections he had been building toward for years without knowing what they were building toward. He sat still for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in the long, slow way that meant it was settling in for the night rather than passing through. "Your father's name was Daniel Calhoun," he said. "Yes." "He owned land in the Clearwater Valley before he died." "Yes." "My mother wrote that Royce Danner filed papers 3 months after my father died. Filed them with the county office as a purchase from the legal heir." She paused. "I was the legal heir. I was 18. I never signed any papers." Garrett stood up. He went to the back of the house, to the small room off the kitchen that served as his office, which was the polite word for the room where he put the things that had no other home. He was back in 2 minutes with a wooden box, rectangular, the wood darkened with age and handling. He set it on the table and opened the latch. Inside was a stack of documents organized with the careful attention of a man who had expected to need them someday and had kept them against that day. He sorted through them without speaking, and when he found what he was looking for, he laid it on the table beside her mother's letter. It was a property record filed with the Clearwater County Land Office in January of 1882. Transfer of title for a parcel of 112 acres in the Eastern Valley, previously held by one Daniel Calhoun, transferred to Royce Danner by purchase from heir. The signature on the line marked heir was not Ivy's name written in Ivy's hand. Ivy looked at it for a long time. "I've had this for 4 years, Garrett said. He was watching her face. "I pulled it when I was building my own case against the consortium. Found it in the county records and recognized the pattern. Same method they used on others. The heir's signature was always the weak point, always a forgery or a coercion, always someone who didn't know what they were signing or didn't know they were being defrauded until it was too late." Ivy looked up from the document. "You've been holding this for 4 years?" "Yes." "Why didn't you do anything with it?" He was quiet. The question sat between them and he let it sit there, which was its own kind of answer. The answer of a man who has a reason he is not yet ready to give. "Because I stopped," he said finally. "Someone gave me a reason to stop, and I took it." "What reason?" He looked at the fire for a long moment. "That's a thing I'll tell you," he said. "But not tonight." She looked at him. She thought about pushing. She decided not to. "All right," she said. "What I can tell you tonight," he said, "is that between your mother's letter and this record and the documents I already have on the consortium's methods, we have enough to take to a federal examiner. Not the county court, not Sheriff Greer. A federal examiner someone Royce Danner doesn't have 20 years of proximity with. Ivy was quiet for a moment. Danner's filing in county court. Clem said a week. I know. Can we get to a federal examiner in a week? Maybe not get to one, Garrett said. But we can get enough documentation to a lawyer in Helena who can request a federal review. That would freeze the county proceedings until the federal examination is complete. He looked at the documents on the table. It would buy us time. Ivy looked at the property record at the forged signature that bore her name without being her name. He took everything, she said. Not with heat, not with tears, with the flat, factual tone of a person taking an inventory. He took the land when I was 18. He took me in as his ward when I was 9, and I thought that meant something. I thought that meant he was a person who had seen a child who needed a home and made a decision to provide one. And the whole time, she stopped. She looked at the fire. The whole time he was keeping me close enough to manage, she said, close enough that I would never have the distance to see the full shape of what he'd done. Garrett said nothing. He had learned in the weeks since she had arrived that there were moments when saying nothing was not absence but presence, a different kind of being there. She turned back to the documents. Tell me what we need, she said. He told her. They sat at that table until after midnight going through everything in the box, and by the time they were done there was a stack of papers in the center of the table that told a story. A clear and documented story with a beginning and a method and a pattern. And at the center of it was a name that appeared on every relevant document, the same name Royce Danner again and again like a signature on a crime. When they finally stood up from the table, Ivy looked at him. Why did you keep all of this? She said. For 4 years. Why keep it if you weren't going to use it? He thought about it honestly. Because I wasn't ready, he said. And because I thought someday I might be. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you ready now? She asked. He looked at the stack of documents. He thought about Clara. He thought about the notebook on the porch that he still had not opened. He thought about a woman who had been sitting in a stock pen for 10 days, working at a knot with a piece of wire methodically without panic waiting. Yes, he said. The storm came from the northwest on a Wednesday evening, which was not unusual for late January in the Clearwater Valley, but this one came with an intention that distinguished it from ordinary winter weather. Garrett felt it before it arrived, the way men who have lived close to land for a long time feel changes in weather in the pressure of the air and the particular silence that descends before something large happens. The horses felt it too. By 4 in the afternoon they were restless in their stalls, shifting their weight and rolling their eyes at the walls the way animals do when they know something is coming and cannot explain the knowing. He spent the early evening securing what could be secured, extra hay into the barn, the water trough heater checked and reset, the loose shutter on the east side of the house that he had been meaning to fix for 2 weeks finally nailed down properly. He moved through these preparations with the methodical focus of a man who had been through enough Montana winters to know that preparation before was always cheaper than repair after. Ivy worked alongside him without being asked. She had done that increasingly in the past week, appearing when there was work to be done with the quiet purposefulness of someone who has decided that the best way to occupy a space is to be useful in it. She carried hay with him. She topped off the water in the barn buckets. She checked the latch on the chicken coop twice, which was once more than he had thought to check it. Neither of them talked much while they worked. This was one of the things Garrett had discovered about her, that she was comfortable with working silence in a way that most people were not, that she did not fill silence with noise because she was afraid of what the silence said. He found this more comfortable than he would have expected, given that he had spent 3 years in a house that had a different kind of silence entirely. Agnes had made a large pot of stew that afternoon, more than the 3 of them could eat, which was Agnes's way of preparing for conditions that might keep them inside for a day or 2. She had also, without comment, moved the kindling basket inside from the porch and filled it past the rim. By 8 o'clock the wind was serious. By 9 it was the kind of thing that makes a house feel small. Garrett went to bed at his usual hour because rest was practical, because a man who does not sleep is less useful than a man who does. And he had developed over years the soldier's ability to sleep when sleep was available regardless of conditions. He lay in the dark, listening to the wind work at the house, and felt the house hold, and he was most of the way to sleep when he heard the sound. He was on his feet before he was fully awake. Not an unfamiliar sequence. The sound was from the barn. Not the normal sounds of horses in a storm, the stamping and the occasional whinny of animals expressing displeasure. This was something different. The particular percussion of a stall board giving way, a crack of wood sharp enough to cut through the wind's noise, followed by the hollow thunder of hooves on frozen ground, moving fast and then moving away. He pulled on his boots in the dark. He was reaching for his coat when he heard the door. Not the front door. The side door, the one off the kitchen, the one closest to the barn. He heard it open. He heard it close. He already knew. He was out the front door in under a minute, coat half buttoned, moving around the side of the house in the direction of the barn, and he could see from 30 yards away that the stall door was swinging open in the wind, the younger horse gone, the older mare standing in the back of the barn with her ears flat and her eyes showing white. He heard Ivy before he saw her. Not a scream. A sharp exhalation, the sound a person makes when they are working hard at something physically demanding and not wasting breath on anything unnecessary. It came from beyond the barn, from the direction of the east pasture, where the ground sloped toward the drainage ravine that ran along the property's lower edge. Garrett ran. He found them at the ravine's edge, in the place where the bank had undercut itself over years of spring melt and left a lip of frozen ground that looked solid and was not. The young horse had gotten one foreleg into the gap where the bank had collapsed inward, not deep enough to break the leg, but enough to trap it in the frozen roots and packed earth. And it was the particular terror of entrapment rather than pain that had the animal in a state of pure panic, throwing its weight against the ground in ways that were making the situation worse with every movement. Ivy had herself pressed against the horse's shoulder, her weight against its side, her voice low and continuous, a stream of words so quiet he could not make them out over the wind, but that clearly had some effect because the horse's movements were marginally less violent than they would otherwise have been. Her hands were moving over the leg near the trap, feeling for the configuration of the entanglement. Not pulling yet, understanding before pulling. Her hands were bleeding. The frozen roots had gotten to them. She had not stopped. Garrett dropped to his knees on the other side of the leg. For the next 20 minutes they worked without speaking except for necessary instructions. Him digging at the frozen earth around the trapped leg with his hands and a flat piece of wood he found nearby. Her maintaining the pressure of her body against the horse's side and her voice against its panic. The cold was absolute. His hands stopped hurting after the first 5 minutes and became simply instruments, numb and functional. When the leg came free, it came suddenly the way trapped things do, and the horse lurched forward hard enough to knock Ivy sideways. Garrett caught her before she hit the ground, which was automatic, the action of a body that reacts before the mind issues instructions, and he held her by both arms while the horse found its footing and stood shaking in the wind. She was shaking too, but from cold, not fear. He looked at her hands. "Come on," he said. She did not argue. Inside, Agnes was already awake because Agnes had apparently also heard the stall board, and she had water heating and the lamp up by the time they came through the kitchen door. She looked at Ivy's hands, looked at Garrett, and without saying a word went to the shelf where she kept her medical stores and began pulling things down. Agnes worked on Ivy's hands with a competence that came from decades of living in a place where the nearest doctor was half a day's ride on a good day. She cleaned the cuts with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood what untreated cold injuries led to, and Ivy sat at the table and let her, and said nothing. Garrett pulled off his own boots and sat across from them and watched Agnes work. He watched Ivy's face. She was looking at Agnes's hands as they worked with a particular attention, a quality of looking that was not passive. She was watching Agnes in the way she watched everything that mattered to her, with the fullness of a person who understands that what they are seeing might need to be remembered. Agnes pressed a cloth soaked in something against a deeper cut on Ivy's right palm, and Ivy's jaw tightened fractionally, but she did not pull away. "She needs to sleep," Agnes said to the room rather than to either of them. "I'm fine," Ivy said. "You're not fine," Agnes said in the tone of someone who has been managing people's assessments of their own condition for 62 years. "You're functional, which is different." Something crossed Ivy's face that was almost amusement. Agnes stood, gathered her materials, and paused beside Ivy's chair. What she did then was small, and she did it quickly as if she did not want it observed. She put her hand briefly on top of Ivy's bandaged hand, not pressing, just resting there for a moment. Then she took it away and went back to the shelf without looking at either of them. Garrett looked at the fire. He sat with it for a long time after Agnes had gone to bed, and Ivy was still at the table, her bandaged hands around a mug, her eyes at something beyond the lamp's circle of light. "Go to sleep," he said. "In a minute." He looked at her profile in the lamplight. She was pale from the cold and the bleeding, but her jaw was set with that particular forward quality. She had the quality of a woman who faced things rather than looked away from them. "The horse is all right," she said. "Leg might be tender for a few days. Nothing broken." "Good." A pause. "Why did you go out after it?" he asked. She thought about it. "Because it was scared," she said. "And because it didn't understand that the thing trapping it was something that could be undone. It just knew it couldn't move and it was panicking." She looked at her mug. "I understand that feeling." He said nothing. She looked at him then directly, which was something she had been doing more often in recent days, looking directly rather than assessing from an angle. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "You said you stopped 4 years ago. You said someone gave you a reason to stop investigating Danner and you took it." She waited. "You said you'd tell me." The fire settled in the stove with a low sound. Garrett looked at his hands on the table, the hands that had dug in frozen ground an hour ago, red and raw and still carrying the cold. "Royce Danner came to me in Billings," he said. "I was there working a contract job in November of 1882. Clara was sick. Not dying sick yet, just winter sick, but sick enough that I was worried, and she was refusing to let me come home because she said we needed the money." He paused. "Danner found me at the boarding house. I don't know how he knew I was there. He probably had people watching the ranch watching to see when I left." He stopped. "He told me he knew I had been gathering information about the consortium. He told me he could make it go away. He said there were people in Helena who could bury what I had found before it reached anyone who could act on it. He said the only thing he wanted in return was for me to stop." Another pause. "And then he told me he knew where to get the medication Clara needed, the kind that wasn't available in Clearwater or Billings, the kind that had to come from back east. He said he had contacts. He said if I stopped, he would make sure the medicine arrived." The kitchen was very quiet. "I stopped," he said. "I put everything in the box, and I stopped. I told myself it was because of Clara, that it was the right thing to do for her." His voice was flat, not self-pitying, the voice of a man reading a record that he finds difficult, but has decided to read accurately. "The medicine never came. Clara died that February." Ivy looked at him. "He lied to you?" she said. "Yes." "He used her to stop you and then let her die anyway?" "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. "And you've been living with that," she said. "The idea that you stopped for nothing, that you made a choice and it cost you everything and didn't even do what it was supposed to do." He looked at the fire. "That's about right." She was quiet for a long moment. "Garrett." Her voice was different. Not softer exactly, but more direct, stripped of the careful measurement she usually applied to what she said. "He made you an impossible choice. A man who loves his wife, and a man who is trying to do right by strangers, and you could only be one of them. And he knew that. He designed it that way." She paused. "That's not a failing. That's what it looks like when someone who is very good at being cruel chooses you as a target." He did not answer. "Clara knew," she said. He looked at her. "Agnes told me," she said carefully, "that Clara knew things she kept to herself to protect you. Agnes didn't tell me what things, but I think you know." He was very still. He reached into his shirt pocket slowly and took out the notebook. He set it on the table between them and looked at it the same way she had seen him look at it every night on the porch. Not opening it, just acknowledging it. "Her journal," he said. Agnes gave it to me after she died. I've carried it for 3 years. He looked at it. I haven't opened it. Why not? Because I'm afraid of what's in it. He said it plainly, without shame, the way a man states a fear he has decided to stop hiding from. I'm afraid she knew what Danner did, what I agreed to, and I'm afraid of reading what she thought about it. Ivy looked at the journal. She loved you, she said. Whatever is in there came from that. He looked at her. Something passed between them in that moment, not romantic, not yet anything that could be named that simply, but something that was more than the transactional arrangement of two people sharing a difficult situation. Something that had been building in the small daily gestures and the working silences and the third mug of coffee left on the porch rail. An understanding. Two people who had been carrying things alone for a long time, recognizing that in each other. He put his hand on the journal. He did not open it, but he left his hand on it. Danner filed in county court, he said. Clem said a week. Yes. We need to get to Helena. Yes. I'll go tomorrow, early. We'll go, she said. He looked at her. We'll go, she said again. And there was something final in it, not aggressive, just settled the tone of a person who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. He looked at her bandaged hands. You can't ride like that. I can ride like anything, she said. He almost smiled. She saw it, the almost, and she filed it away in the same place she filed all the small things that were building into a larger understanding of who this man was. Go to sleep, she said, using his own words from earlier. He stood. He picked up the journal. He stood with it in his hand for a moment, and then he did something she did not expect. He set it back down on the table. He looked at it one more time. He went to his room. Ivy sat alone in the kitchen with the dying fire and the lamp and the journal on the table, and she thought about a woman named Clara, who had loved a man with enough intention to protect him even in dying, who had written things down that she expected someone to read someday. She thought about her own mother's letter. She thought about the documents in the wooden box. She thought about Clem Hatcher riding away and stopping to say what he thought was worth something. She thought about all the small acts of conscience that exist in the margins of obligation, the things people do when they have the option not to, when doing them costs something but not doing them costs more. She got up and turned down the lamp. At the window she paused. Outside the storm had not stopped, but it had changed. The wind was still there, but the quality of it was different now. Less violent, more sustained, the sound of something settling into a long patience rather than a short rage. She put her bandaged hand against the cold glass. Somewhere out there, 3 days' hard ride north, Royce Danner was preparing for a court appearance that he believed he controlled. He did not yet know what was in the box on the kitchen table. He did not yet know about the letter or the forged signature or the man who had spent 4 years carrying evidence he had not been ready to use. He did not yet know that the woman he had kept within arm's reach for years to prevent exactly this moment had spent the last 3 weeks sitting at a kitchen table with a man who had the other half of a story that neither of them had known was shared. Ivy took her hand from the glass. She went to bed. She slept. And in the morning, when the storm had finally reduced itself to the quiet persistence of ordinary winter, she was at the barn before Garrett saddling the horse he would have saddled for her, with her bandaged hands, working the cinch slowly but accurately because she had told him she could ride like anything, and she intended to be correct. He house held. The road to Helena was 3 days in winter if the weather held, and considerably longer if it did not. They left before the sun had fully committed to rising in that particular blue-gray hour when Montana mornings look like something that has not yet decided what it wants to be. Agnes stood on the porch with her arms crossed and watched them go without offering sentiment, which was her way, and when the wagon had rounded the first bend and disappeared into the tree line, she went back inside and did something she had not done in 3 years. She opened the drawer where she kept the recipe cards and took out the one in Clara's handwriting and propped it against the flour jar on the counter. Then she started making bread. The road followed the river valley north for the first day, and it was not a comfortable road, frozen hard in the ruts and treacherous at the crossings where the ice was thin over moving water, and Garrett drove with the careful attention of a man who understood that the difference between arriving and not arriving was mostly a matter of not making the obvious mistakes. Ivy sat beside him on the bench and did not complain about the cold or the jolting or the time, because she was not a person who complained about conditions she had chosen. She had chosen these conditions. They did not talk much that first day. They were past the stage where silence required explanation, and not yet at the stage where they talked freely, which meant they existed in the productive middle ground of two people who have established enough mutual understanding to be comfortable with what they do not say. At midday they stopped to rest the horses and eat from the provisions Agnes had packed without being asked, which were more extensive than necessary, in the way that Agnes's preparations were always more extensive than necessary, a form of care she expressed through practical excess rather than declaration. Ivy unwrapped a parcel and found cornbread wrapped in cloth still faintly warm from the morning. She looked at it for a moment. Garrett glanced at her expression. "Agnes," he said simply. "I know," she said. They ate. The second day brought them out of the valley and onto the higher road that ran along the eastern face of the Elkhorn Range, and here the wind was serious and constant in the way of high elevation, wind relentless and impersonal, and the sky was the hard white of a sky that cannot decide between snow and mercy. They made camp that night in a shallow depression in the hillside that offered some protection, and Garrett built a fire with the efficiency of someone who had camped in worse conditions under worse circumstances, and they sat on opposite sides of it and ate and were warmer than they had any right to expect. It was there at that fire on the second night that Garrett opened the journal. He did not announce that he was going to do it. He reached into his coat and took it out and looked at it for a moment, the way he always looked at it, and then with the particular resolution of a man who has decided that the time for waiting has passed, he opened the cover. Ivy looked up from the fire. She saw what he was doing. She looked back at the fire and said nothing. He read for a long time. She could not see his face clearly across the fire. She could see the set of his shoulders, and she watched those instead reading the text of him, the way she had learned to read him in posture and pause rather than expression. He read for nearly an hour. When he closed the journal, he sat with it in his hands for several minutes before he spoke. "She knew," he said, "about Danner coming to me in Billings, about what he offered." He stopped. "She found out 3 weeks before she died. She wrote it down." Ivy waited. "She was not angry," he said. The words came out with a quality that suggested he was still working out what to do with them. "She wrote that she understood why I made the choice I made, that she would have made the same choice." He looked at the fire. "She wrote that she was telling me in the journal instead of to my face because she did not want me to see her tell me and think she was being brave for my benefit. She wanted me to read it after when she wasn't there to perform anything." The fire cracked. "She wrote that she wanted me to finish it," he said, "what I had started. She wrote that she did not want what Danner did to be the last word on either of them." Ivy looked at him across the fire. He looked back at her. "That's why she kept the journal," Ivy said quietly. "She kept it for this, for when you were ready." He looked down at the journal in his hands. "Agnes knew." "Yes." "Agnes knew and waited 3 years for me to be ready." "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. The fire between them burned steadily, not dramatically, just doing what fire does, providing light and heat, without commentary on what the light revealed. "Clara would have liked you," he said. It came out without premeditation, the way honest things sometimes do, arriving before the speaker has fully evaluated them. Ivy looked at him. "She would have respected you," he said. "That's what I mean. She respected people who were honest about hard things." Ivy was quiet for a moment. "I would have liked to know her," she said. They let the fire burn down to coals before they slept. Helena, in winter, was a city that conducted its business under a permanent layer of civic seriousness, the particular gravity of a place that knew it was in the process of becoming something important and was not yet sure how to carry the weight of that knowledge. The territorial capital sat in its valley with its government buildings and its commerce and its population of people who had come from somewhere else with ambitions of various kinds, and it was large enough that strangers passing through did not require explanation. They arrived on the evening of the third day. Garrett had a name, a lawyer named Theodore Marsh, who operated out of an office above the hardware store on Main Street, and who had the reputation of a man who took cases that other lawyers found inconvenient. Garrett had used him 4 years ago on the consortium matter and had found him competent and without illusions about the way things worked. Marsh opened his office door at 7 in the evening and looked at the two of them on his landing without visible surprise, which was the mark of a man who had been visited by people with urgent problems at inconvenient hours enough times that he had stopped being surprised by it. "Pruitt," he said. "Come in." They spread the documents on Marsh's desk, and Garrett talked while Marsh read, and Ivy answered questions when Marsh directed them to her, which he did directly, looking at her with the focused attention of a man assessing a witness rather than a person, which was its own form of respect. He read the forged signature document twice. He read Lena Calhoun's letter 3 times. He read the consortium records and the property transfer documents and the contract from Sutter's Post, and he sat back in his chair when he was done and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "The county court filing is scheduled for day after tomorrow," Garrett said. "I know about the filing," Marsh said. "Danner's been preparing this for months. He has Judge Holloway on the county bench, and Holloway owes Danner more money than he'll admit to anyone, including himself." He tapped the forged signature document. "This changes the shape of things considerably. Can you get a federal review request filed before the county proceeding?" Marsh looked at him. "If I start tonight and don't sleep, yes." "What does that do to the county proceeding?" "It doesn't stop it. But it creates a parallel track that Holloway cannot ignore without creating federal problems for himself, which is the one thing that frightens men in Holloway's position more than Royce Danner." Marsh looked at Ivy. "You understand that this is not a guaranteed outcome. Federal review means scrutiny, and scrutiny takes time, and in the interim, Danner's legal standing regarding the contract claim is not resolved." "I understand," Ivy said. "You also understand that once this document," he tapped the letter, "becomes part of a federal filing, it becomes public record. What your mother wrote in it will be read by people you don't know in circumstances you can't control." Ivy thought about her mother, about the handwriting crowded at the margins, about the things that had needed to be said on not enough paper. "My mother wrote it down," she said. "She meant for it to be read." Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled a sheet of paper toward himself and picked up his pen. "Come back at 9 in the morning," he said. "I'll have the federal petition ready. You'll both need to sign it as co-complainants." He looked at Garrett. "You understand that puts you in this officially. Your name on a federal petition against Royce Danner." "I know what it means," Garrett said. Marsh nodded. He was already writing. They found a boarding house 2 streets over and took separate rooms, and Ivy lay in a bed that was not her own in a city that was not her home, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the morning. She thought about Royce Danner. She had been thinking about him since Clem Hatcher had mentioned what Clem had mentioned. The thing she had not expected, the thing that sat uncomfortably in her chest, next to the harder and cleaner feeling of righteous anger. He had taken her in when she was 9 years old. She had not invented that. She had not misremembered it or softened it through the sentimentality of childhood. He had been for years a man who fed her and housed her and did not strike her and did not permit others to treat her badly. She had learned to read in his house. She had learned to manage accounts in his house. She had learned for a period of years that she could not revise out of history that an adult could provide for a child without visible motive. And then she had gotten older, and he had discovered who her father was, and everything had changed. She tried to hold both things at once. The man who had picked up a 9-year-old girl from a neighbor's porch because no one else would, and the man who had spent years subsequently ensuring that the same girl would never have the freedom or the resources to discover what he had taken from her. She could not reconcile them into a single person she understood. She was not sure that was something she needed to do tonight. What she needed to do tonight was sleep. She slept. The county courthouse the next morning was the kind of building that had been constructed to communicate the authority of law through architecture, heavy stone, high windows, the particular coldness of official spaces designed to make individuals feel appropriately small. Garrett and Ivy arrived at 8:30 and met Marsh on the steps, who handed them each a copy of the federal petition and directed them to sign where he had marked with small penciled arrows. Ivy signed her name carefully. Ivy Calhoun, her own name in her own hand on a legal document that was hers. She looked at the signature for a moment after the pen left the paper. "The petition was filed this morning at 7, Marsh said. "The federal district office will notify Judge Holloway's court within the hour. The county proceeding will continue as scheduled, but Holloway will know that everything he does today is being watched from above." He looked at them both. "Danner will know too within the hour. He will have been notified as the named respondent." "What does he do when he knows?" Garrett asked. That, Marsh said, depends on what kind of man he is when the situation he's built for himself becomes one he can no longer manage. They went inside. The courtroom was not large, and it was not full. Court proceedings over land contracts and labor disputes did not draw audiences in Helena the way criminal cases did, and the people present were mostly functionaries, clerks and a bailiff, and two men who appeared to be there as witnesses for Danner's side, and who looked at Garrett and Ivy with the careful blankness of people paid to be present rather than invested. Royce Danner was already there. Ivy had not seen him in 3 months. He looked the same and not the same heavy-set frame, the same gray at his temples, the same quality of careful presentation that had always characterized him, the vest brushed clean, the watch chain visible, the posture of a man accustomed to being the most substantial person in a room. But something had changed in the set of his face that she noticed immediately. Something had tightened around his eyes. He had received the notification. He knew about the federal petition. He looked at Ivy when she came in, a long look, and she returned it without expression, the way she returned most things now, with the steady gray attention that had learned not to flinch. Then he looked at Garrett. The look he gave Garrett was different. It was the look of a man making a recognition, fitting a piece into a shape he had not completed until this moment. He looked at Garrett for several seconds with an expression that moved through several stages, and the last stage, the one it settled on, was something that Ivy would not have expected. It looked almost like resignation. Deputy Clem Hatcher arrived at 9:05. He came through the back of the courtroom and sat in the row behind Garrett and Ivy, and leaned forward and said quietly, "Sheriff Greer knows about the federal petition. He's not happy. But he's not going to do anything that gets him on the wrong side of a federal examiner either." Garrett did not turn around. "You came all the way to Helena." "I had business here," Clem said. After a pause, "The business was this." Marsh beside them did not look up from his papers, but something in his posture acknowledged the arrival with quiet approval. Judge Holloway came in and took his seat and looked at his desk, and then at the room, and then at the papers in front of him, with the expression of a man who had expected a routine morning and found something considerably more complicated. He shuffled through the documents for a moment, and when he looked up, his gaze went to Danner's table, and what passed between them in that look was not readable to anyone in the room, but it was clearly something, a communication between two men who had an understanding now being revised under the pressure of circumstances neither had anticipated. Holloway called the proceeding to order. Danner's lawyer began to present the case, and it was a competent presentation: the contract, the guardianship claim, the breach of arrangement. Marsh listened without interrupting, making small notes on his pad, and when it was his turn he stood and presented the federal petition and its basis calmly and without theater, the forged signature on the property. Transfer the letter, the consortium, records the pattern of documented fraud that had been built over years and was now assembled into a single coherent argument. Holloway listened. He listened with the careful attention of a man who is doing arithmetic in his head while appearing to evaluate evidence. In the middle of Marsh's presentation, Royce Danner stood up. His lawyer touched his arm. Danner removed the hand gently but firmly. "Your Honor," he said. Holloway looked at him. "I'd like to request a recess," Danner said. Holloway, looking relieved, granted it immediately. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Danner found Ivy. He did not approach her with the posture of a man who expects to win. He approached with the posture of a man who has arrived at a calculation and is presenting its result. He was alone. His lawyer was behind him by 20 feet, looking uncertain. Garrett moved to stand beside Ivy. Danner looked at him, then back at Ivy. "I'm not going to fight the federal petition," he said. He said it simply, without preamble. "I want you to know that. I've instructed my lawyer to withdraw the county filing." Ivy looked at him. "The land will be transferred back," he said. "I'll sign whatever documentation Marsh prepares. All of it." He said it like a man reading items from a list, each one costing him something, each one delivered with the flat acceptance of someone who has done the accounting and understands the balance. "Why?" Ivy said. He looked at her for a moment. In the look was something she had not seen on his face before, or perhaps had seen and not recognized when she was younger and less practiced at reading people. It was not guilt exactly. Guilt was too simple. It was the more complex expression of a man who has looked at the full shape of what he has done and cannot find a frame for it that does not require him to be someone he does not want to be. "Because I remember why I took you in," he said quietly. "Before I knew who your father was. Before any of that. I took you in because you were 9 years old, and you needed someone." He stopped. "I stopped being that person somewhere. I don't entirely know when. I know that I did." He looked at Garrett. "I also know what I did to your wife, what I offered and didn't deliver." He paused. "I'm sorry for that. I know what that's worth, which isn't much." Garrett said nothing. Danner looked at Ivy again. "What I did cannot be addressed by an apology. I'm not offering one as if it addresses anything. I'm just telling you that I will not make this harder than it needs to be." He straightened his coat. "I'll sign the documents today." He turned and walked back toward the courtroom. Ivy watched him go. Garrett watched her watch him go. She was quiet for a long moment. "That's not what I expected," she said. "No," he said. "I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it today." She looked at him. "He ruined my life and my mother's life and your wife's life, and he said sorry, and now I'm supposed to—" She stopped. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel." "You're not supposed to feel anything specific," he said. "You're allowed to feel whatever it actually is." She looked at her hands, the bandaged one and the less bandaged one, and she thought about what it actually was. The complicated thing in her chest that was not forgiveness and not continued rage, but something without a clean name, something that recognized the man she had seen in that hallway without excusing what she also knew he was. "He was good to me once," she said. "Before he wasn't." "Yes. That doesn't make what came after acceptable." "No, it doesn't. But it means he's not only one thing." "No," Garrett said. "People rarely are." She stood in the hallway for another moment. Then she straightened her own coat in a gesture that echoed Danner's so precisely that Garrett noticed it, and she walked back into the courtroom. The withdrawal was entered into the court record at 10:30 that morning. Marsh filed the supporting documentation with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for this outcome as well as the other one, which was what good lawyers did. And by noon, the relevant paperwork had been signed by Danner in the presence of the court clerk, and the process of transferring the Calhoun land back to its rightful owner had been formally initiated. Ivy signed her name 4 times, each time the same signature. Ivy Calhoun, her own hand. On the 4th signature, she set the pen down and sat for a moment with both hands flat on the clerk's desk, feeling the solidity of the wood under her palms, and she thought about her mother writing a letter on not enough paper, crowding the margins to get everything in, trusting that someday someone would read it and know what to do. She thought about her father, whom she did not remember except in the abstract way of something known through description rather than experience, a man who had worked a piece of Montana ground and believed it would pass to his daughter, and had been wrong about that, had been wrong in the way that people are wrong when they trust that what they build will be protected by the same world they built it in. She thought about the 9-year-old girl who had sat on a porch in the winter of 1871 with nowhere to go, and the man who had come out of his house and said, "Come inside." She thought about all of it at once, holding it the way you hold complicated things, not resolving it, just containing it, recognizing that some things are not meant to simplify. Then she picked up the pen again and signed the final document. Clem Hatcher was waiting outside the court building when they came out. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pulled down against the Helena wind, and when he saw them come through the doors he straightened up and looked at their faces and read the result there before either of them said anything. He nodded. "Good," he said. One word. It carried the weight of someone who had been waiting for a while to be able to say it. Garrett extended his hand. Clem shook it. "You came a long way," Garrett said. "I had business here," Clem said again. Then, with the self-awareness of a younger man acknowledging the limits of his own pretense, "I wanted to know how it came out. I wanted to be here when it came out." Ivy looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for telling us about the timeline, and for coming." Clem nodded. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the gratitude the way people who do things out of conscience rather than calculation sometimes are. "I'm going to need to have a conversation with Sheriff Greer when I get back," he said. "About some things I should have said earlier than I said them." "How will that go?" Garrett asked. Clem thought about it. "I don't know. Depends on whether he's more interested in covering what he let happen or in making sure it doesn't happen again." A pause. "I'm going to make the conversation happen regardless." He put his hat back on. "I'll see you back in Clearwater," he said, and walked away down the Helena Street with the posture of a man who has decided what kind of man he is going to be and is walking in that direction. They left Helena the following morning. The road back was the same road, but it felt different the way roads feel different when the journey they carry has changed. The sky on the first day was clear, which was unusual for February in Montana, and the mountains to the west were fully visible against the blue, every ridge and fold of them, distinct, carrying their snow in the particular way that mountains carry snow, as if it belongs to them, rather than having been deposited on them by weather. Ivy looked at the mountains for a long time. She looked at them the way she had looked at Garrett in the early days, with the careful attention of someone committing a landscape to memory. But it was different now. The attention of someone claiming rather than cataloging, of someone who is looking at a thing and beginning to understand that it is theirs to look at. On the second night they camped again in the Elkhorns in a different depression from the one on the way up, but similar enough, and Garrett built a fire with the same efficiency, and they sat on the same sides of it. He had the journal again. He opened it without hesitation this time. He read for an hour. When he closed it, he held it differently than he had before. Not with the white-knuckled grip of someone holding something they cannot bring themselves to open, but with the ordinary care of something he intended to keep. "She wrote about you," he said. Ivy looked up. "About you specifically," he said. "At the end. After I left to come back from Billings that last time. She wrote that she hoped I would find someone who would make me remember that the world had more in it than what I could do alone." He looked at the fire. "She wrote that she was not saying that because she was dying and wanted me to move forward. She said it because she had always known that I was a person who needed someone to move forward with." A pause. "She said that was not a flaw. She said it was just the shape of me." The fire between them did not dramatize this moment. It burned the same. Ivy looked at Garrett across it. She looked at the lines in his face that had no business being there, and were there anyway, at the hands on the journal that had dug in frozen ground and handled documents and driven a wagon 3 days each way, and had been at the beginning of all of this, the hands of a man who had laid down the last thing he owned to free a woman he did not know. "She knew you well," Ivy said. "Better than I knew myself," he said. It was not sad. It was the acknowledgement of something true. They sat for a while without speaking. "What do you want to do with the land?" he asked. She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since the moment the pen left the paper on the final signature, and what she had arrived at was not a plan exactly, not yet, but the shape of one, the way you can see the shape of a house before you have laid the first board. "Build something," she said. "I don't know exactly what yet, but something that's actually there, something you can see from the road and know that it's standing because someone chose to put it there. He looked at her. "It's good land," he said. "Your father worked it well. The soil in the lower section is better than most of what's in the valley. You know it. I've ridden past it for years. It borders my property on the east side." He paused. "I always thought it was a waste. Good land with no one working it." She looked at the fire. "It had someone who should have been working it," she said. "It just took a while to get there." He said nothing. After a while she said, "I'll need help, to start. I know how to work land, but I don't know how to start from nothing, or from what's left of nothing." "I know how to start from nothing," he said. "I know you do." The fire burned. The mountains held their snow and their distance. "Agnes," Ivy said, "what about her? She's going to have opinions about all of this." Something shifted in his face then, something that had been working its way toward the surface for weeks, and for the first time since she had known him, it arrived without apology. He smiled. Not large, not performed, just real. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been waiting for without admitting you were waiting. "Agnes has opinions about everything," he said. "That's never stopped anything." They reached the Pruitt Ranch on the afternoon of the third day to find Agnes on the porch with her arms crossed and her coat on, standing in the cold as if she had been standing there for some time. Garrett pulled the wagon to a stop. Agnes looked at them both with the evaluating expression she brought to everything. "Well," she said. "We filed the federal petition," Garrett said. "Danner withdrew. The land transfer is in process." Agnes stood with this information for a moment. Then she uncrossed her arms, which was for Agnes approximately equivalent to anyone else throwing their arms in the air. "Come inside," she said. "Dinner's been ready for an hour." She went in without looking back. Garrett and Ivy looked at each other. Ivy got down from the wagon and walked to the porch and went inside, and Garrett took the horses to the barn, and in the kitchen Agnes was already at the stove with her back to the door, and the room was warm and smelled of something that had been slow cooking all day. Ivy took off her coat and hung it on the second hook by the door, the one that had been empty. She hung it there without ceremony, the way you put a coat on a hook as a functional act is what it was. But when she turned away from it, she caught Agnes watching her from the stove, and what was on Agnes's face in that moment was not sentiment exactly, was not the soft watercolor expression of a scene in a story where everything resolves gently. It was more like recognition. The recognition of a woman who has been watching a space be empty for a long time and has now seen something occupy it in a way that does not feel like replacement, feels instead like continuation, like the way a house keeps being a house after one person leaves it, not because the person is forgotten, but because the house was always bigger than any single person's presence in it. Agnes turned back to the stove. "Sit down," she said. Ivy sat down. Garrett came in from the barn and washed his hands at the basin and sat across from her, and Agnes brought 3 bowls to the table and sat at the end. That was not the end where the blue coat lived on the chair, the end she had always sat at, and they ate. 3 weeks later the snow began its first serious retreat. Not warmth, not yet, but the incremental yielding of winter that happens in Montana in late February. The slightly longer days, the slight softening of the ice along the south-facing banks of the river, the return of certain birds that winter drives away, and spring brings back birds that do not know they are metaphors, but serve as them anyway. Garrett and Ivy rode out to the Calhoun land on a Tuesday morning. It was 112 acres of eastern valley ground bordered on the west by the Pruitt property and on the east by the public grazing land along the river. The structures on it were not much a collapsed outbuilding, the foundation of a house that had burned sometime in the years of Danner's management, the stone walls still standing to waist height, roofless, filling with the seasons. They rode through it slowly. Ivy said very little. She looked at each section of it the way she had looked at the mountains, with the attention of ownership of someone whose eyes are doing something more than observing. She looked at the lower section where the soil was dark and deep even in winter. She looked at the creek that ran along the northern boundary, still frozen, but running underneath, audible if you stopped and listened. She looked at the stone walls of the old foundation. She stopped her horse beside the foundation and dismounted and walked the perimeter of it, her boots on the frozen ground, her hand trailing along the top of the stone wall. Garrett watched from the saddle. "These walls are good," she said. "Someone built these to last." "Your father," Garrett said. She looked at the stones. She ran her hand along the top course, feeling the placement of them, the care of the fitting. "He knew what he was doing," she said. "He did." She stood in the roofless space of the old foundation with the blue sky open above her and the stone walls of her father's making around her on four sides, and she was very still for a moment, completely still the way she was sometimes when something was happening inside her that she was not yet ready to put into words. Then she looked up at Garrett. "I want to build on this foundation," she said. "Not around it, on it. Use what he built as the base and go up from there." He looked at the walls. He assessed them the way he assessed everything structural with the practical eye of a man who had built and rebuilt things for 20 years. "The west wall will need reinforcing. The mortar on the corner sections is soft." He dismounted and walked to the corner she was looking at, crouched down and pressed his thumb into the mortar between two stones. "Everything else is sound. Can it be done?" He looked at the full perimeter, at the dimensions, at the ground level and the drainage, and the way the lot sat in relation to the prevailing wind. "Yes," he said. "It'll take most of the spring and part of the summer." "I have time," she said. He looked at her. She was standing in the center of the roofless foundation with her hair loose from its pin because the ride had done that, and the morning light was doing what Montana morning light does in late winter, not warm yet but clear, the kind of clarity that makes edges sharp and distances honest. She was looking at the walls around her with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they have been traveling toward for a long time without knowing exactly where they were going. "You'll need materials," he said. "Lumber from the mill in Clearwater, roofing, windows." "Marsh filed the recovery claim against Danner's assets," she said. "It won't be everything he took, but it will be something." He nodded. "Agnes said something to me this morning," Ivy said. She was still looking at the walls. "Before we left." "What did she say?" Ivy was quiet for a moment. "She said she has money. Clara's money. Money she's been holding for 3 years without knowing what to do with it." She paused. "She said she wants to use it for this. She said she's not offering it as charity, and she's not offering it as a loan. She said she's offering it as an investment." Garrett was quiet. "An investment in what?" he asked. "She said in something that's worth building." Ivy looked at him. "I think she means more than the house." The wind moved through the valley in the way of late winter wind, not the brutal wind of January, but something gentler, still cold but with less malice in it, the wind of a season that is considering changing. Garrett stood in the foundation of a house he had not built on land that belonged to a woman who had been kept from it for 6 years, and he thought about Clara writing in her journal in the last winter of her life, writing the things she needed him to read after she was gone. He thought about the look on her face in the last days that he had not known how to interpret then, and understood now the look of a woman who was not peaceful because she had stopped caring, but peaceful because she had finished something, had completed a task she had set herself, had gotten everything she needed to get to the people who would need it. He reached into his coat and took out the journal. He held it for a moment. Then he walked to the stone wall and set it carefully on the top course in a notch between 2 stones where it fit exactly as if the space had been prepared for it. He stepped back. Ivy looked at the journal on the wall. She looked at Garrett. "Leave it there," she asked. "For today," he said. "Just for today. So she's here for this part." Ivy looked at the journal on the stone wall, at the worn cover, and the way the light fell on it in the late winter morning, and something in her face did the thing that it had been learning to do in the weeks since she had arrived at the Pruitt Ranch. The thing that had nothing to do with the self-protective measurement she had practiced for years, and everything to do with what happens when a person begins to feel safe enough to be exactly where they are. She looked at Garrett. He looked at her. They were standing in the open foundation of a house that did not exist yet, on land that had been taken and returned in a valley that was beginning slowly and without ceremony to consider the possibility of spring. Nothing was resolved in the way that easy stories resolve. The land would take work, months of it, heavy and honest work. The recovery claim would proceed through channels that moved slowly and with bureaucratic indifference to urgency. Clem Hatcher would have his conversation with Sheriff Greer, and it would be difficult, and its outcome was not certain. Royce Danner would spend the remainder of his years with the knowledge of what he had been and what he had chosen, and whatever that cost him was between him and the mirror. Agnes would bring lunch to the building site every day at noon. She would not announce that she was doing this. She would simply appear with food at the appropriate time and set it down, and occasionally, when she thought no one was watching, she would run her hand along the top of the stone walls with the same gesture that Ivy had used that morning, the gesture of someone touching something solid and finding it good. What was resolved was simpler and more durable than the resolutions of easy stories. Ivy Calhoun was standing on her own ground. She had the document to prove it, and the intention to build on it, and the knowledge that the foundation under her feet had been laid by hands that were connected to her own through blood and time, and the specific stubbornness of people who put stones together carefully and expect them to hold. Garrett Pruitt was standing beside her, not in front, not behind, beside which was the only position that meant what it needed to mean. He had opened the journal. He had read what was in it, and he had set it on the wall where the light fell on it, and the thing that had been frozen in him for 3 years, the thing that no amount of work or solitude or cold Montana winter had managed to reach, had found in the improbable space of a roofless foundation in February the conditions it needed to begin to thaw. In 6 months, there would be walls above the stone. In 8 months, there would be a roof. Before the next winter, there would be smoke from a chimney. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the light was going, 2 people would sit on a porch that had not existed the winter before, and look at the mountains and not need to fill the silence with anything, because the silence between people who understand each other does not require filling. It requires only the willingness to stay in it together. Garrett picked up Clara's journal from the wall. He held it for a moment. Then he put it in his coat pocket in the place where it had always lived against his chest, where he could feel the weight of it, and this time the weight was not the weight of something he was afraid to open. It was the weight of something he intended to keep. "We should get back," he said. "Agnes will have dinner on." "She always has dinner on," Ivy said. "Yes," he said, "she does." That evening after dinner, Garrett found a parcel on the porch step. No note, no explanation, just a bundle wrapped in oilcloth left without announcement. He unwrapped it at the kitchen table. Inside was the Winchester, his father's rifle, the brass plate stamped RHP, the same rifle he had laid across Sutter's counter to buy a woman her freedom. He held it for a long time without speaking. Ivy stood beside him and looked at it. She did not ask who had sent it. She already knew. Garrett carried the rifle to the hooks by the door and hung it on the empty one. No one said anything. The hook had been empty for weeks. Now it held something again. They mounted. They rode back through the valley in the late afternoon light, the kind of light that turns Montana gold for an hour before the dark comes, and the horses moved at the steady pace of animals that know they are going home, and the mountains watched them go, the way mountains watch everything, without urgency, without judgment, present and enduring and patient, in the way that only things without fear of time can be. The Pruitt Ranch appeared first as a smear of lamplight between the pines, then as a shape, then as a place where someone had left the lamp burning in the window because someone was expected home. Ivy looked at the light in the window. She thought about her mother's letter, about the handwriting crowded at the margins, about everything that had needed to be said on not enough paper. She thought about all the ways a life can be taken from a person before they are old enough to hold it properly, and all the ways it can be rebuilt. Not the same, never the same, but real as stone walls and signed documents and the smell of bread baking in a kitchen where someone left the light on. She thought about what it felt like to be riding toward a light that was left on for her. She thought it felt like enough. She thought it felt like more than enough. She thought it felt like home.